The day my wife left me, she didn't say I wasn't enough. She said something much worse. She said someone else had finally become the man I was never going to be. I still remember the way Victoria Caldwell placed the divorce papers on our kitchen table that evening. The room looked exactly the same as it had every night for the last 12 years. The oak cabinets were warm under the soft lights. The coffee maker still sat beside the counter. The family photos on the wall still showed two people smiling like they had everything figured out. But somehow, in less than 5 minutes, that same kitchen became the place where my old life ended. Victoria stood across from me wearing a designer coat I had never seen before. She looked confident, almost relieved. Behind that confidence was a decision she had already made long before she spoke the words aloud. Ethan, we both know this marriage stopped growing a long time ago. I looked at her and stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had spent years learning that some moments don't need an argument. They need silence. Alexander understands my world, she continued. He has ambition. He has influence. He can give me the future I want. Alexander Reed. I knew the name. Everyone in business knew the name. A millionaire executive. The kind of person whose picture appeared in magazines and whose handshake opened doors. To Victoria, he represented everything exciting, everything powerful, everything she believed I had lost. What she didn't know was that I had walked away from that world by choice. 12 years earlier, I had been surrounded by meetings, investors, and people who measured success by numbers on a screen. I had built something I was proud of. Then I realized I was spending more time chasing achievements than living my life. So I stepped back. I chose a quieter existence. I chose mornings with coffee on the porch instead of private meetings in tall buildings. I chose being present over being impressive. But somewhere along the way, Victoria stopped seeing that as a choice. She started seeing it as weakness. Alexander makes me feel like I belong, she said. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it hurt my pride, because it showed me something important. She wasn't leaving because I had failed. She was leaving because she no longer understood what I valued. I looked down at the papers between us. The signature line waited like a final question. Part of me wanted to remind her of everything we built together. The first apartment where we counted every dollar. The road trips where we got lost and laughed about it. The nights when we believed we were a team against the entire world. But I realized something in that moment. You cannot convince someone to appreciate a chapter they have already decided to close. So I picked up the pen. Victoria watched me carefully. Maybe she expected anger. Maybe she expected desperation. Maybe she expected me to fight for the person she had become. Instead, I signed my name. That's it, she asked. I looked at her. You already made your choice. She was silent for a second. Then she gathered the papers and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. I hope you find what you're looking for, Ethan. I almost smiled. Because the truth was, I had never lost it. I watched the door close and listened to the quiet that followed. It wasn't the sound of losing everything. It was the sound of finally understanding something I had ignored for too long. Some people only recognize your value after they discover they walked away from it. That night, Victoria believed she was leaving behind an ordinary man. She had no idea she was walking away from the person who had quietly built the world she wanted to enter. And she definitely had no idea that one day, the same man she underestimated would be standing in front of the person she chose instead, and that person would have only one thing to say. Sir. After Victoria walked out of my life, I discovered something strange about silence. It does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes silence is where you finally hear the truth. The first few days after the divorce felt unfamiliar. Not because I missed the noise of arguments or the constant pressure to prove myself. I missed the version of life I thought we were building together. There is a difference between losing a person and losing the future you imagined with that person. I learned that difference sitting alone in the same house where Victoria and I had once planned everything. I kept the routine I had built over the years. Every morning at 6:30, I made coffee, opened the windows, and watched the neighborhood wake up. The houses looked the same. The lawns were still perfectly trimmed. The same families drove their children to school. Life continued as if nothing had changed. That was the strange thing about heartbreak. The world does not stop just because yours does. For a while, I wondered if Victoria was right about me. Maybe I had become too comfortable. Maybe stepping away from the business world had made people forget who I was. Maybe I had allowed myself to become invisible. Those thoughts followed me until I remembered why I left in the first place. 12 years earlier, I had stood inside a glass office tower on the 42nd floor, looking down at a city full of people chasing the same thing I had spent years chasing. More growth, more money, more recognition. Every achievement gave me another reason to keep going, but every achievement also took something from me. I missed birthdays. I missed quiet evenings. I missed moments that could never be replaced by another business deal. So I made a decision most people did not understand. I stepped away from the company I built and trusted other people to continue the work. I kept my investments private and lived simply. To strangers, I looked like a man who had slowed down. To people who knew the truth, I was a man who had already achieved what most people spent their entire lives chasing. But Victoria never saw that side of me anymore. She saw the quiet house. She saw the old truck in the driveway. She saw a husband who preferred a simple dinner over expensive events. She confused peace with failure. A week after she left, I received a message from an old friend named Daniel Brooks. Daniel had worked with me during the early years of my company. He was one of the few people who knew the full story. I heard what happened, he wrote. Are you doing okay? I stared at the message for a long time before answering. I am fine. Better than I expected. A few minutes later, he called me. Ethan, I know you do not like talking about the past, but you need to remember something. You did not disappear. You chose to step away. His words stayed with me. Because he was right. I had spent years allowing people to believe whatever story they wanted. I never corrected anyone when they assumed I was just another ordinary man. I never explained my history because I did not need applause from people who did not know me. But then Daniel said something that changed the way I looked at everything. The world has a way of finding out the truth when the timing is right. I smiled because I knew what he meant. There were still people in business who remembered my name. There were still contracts that carried my decisions. There were still leaders who respected the foundation I created. I just had no interest in reminding anyone. Until that changed. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to attend a private business meeting. It was not unusual. Even after stepping away, there were occasional moments when my opinion was requested. But this invitation was different. The company involved was one I knew very well. A company currently led by Alexander Reed. I looked at the name on the invitation and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not bitterness, just curiosity. Because life has a way of bringing people back to the same places where they once made their biggest mistakes. And this time, I was not walking into that room as the man Victoria left behind. I was walking in as the person she never truly knew. The first time I saw Alexander Reed's name on that invitation, I did not think about Victoria. I thought about the years I spent building something most people never knew existed. That was the strange part about walking away from success. People assume leaving the spotlight means you no longer matter. They mistake silence for weakness. They mistake simplicity for failure. Alexander had become the face of the company I once created. His interviews appeared online. His picture was featured in business magazines. He was the person everyone recognized when they talked about innovation and growth. To the outside world, he was the man who had reached the top. But there was one thing almost nobody knew. The foundation he was standing on had been built long before he arrived. I arrived at the meeting location 20 minutes early. It was a private executive conference room in downtown Chicago, a place filled with polished wood tables, glass walls, and people who carried themselves with confidence. I had been in rooms like this many times before. The difference was that years ago, people knew my name before I walked through the door. Now, most people simply saw a man wearing a simple jacket carrying a leather folder. And honestly, I preferred it that way. The receptionist checked my name and gave me a polite smile. Mr. Caldwell, they are expecting you. I nodded and walked toward the conference room. As I entered, I noticed several executives already seated around the table. Some looked familiar. Some did not. Then I saw him. Alexander Reed. He was exactly how I imagined. Confident. Professional. Surrounded by people who listened whenever he spoke. He looked up when I entered, and for a brief second, I noticed confusion on his face. He clearly recognized my name, but could not place where he knew it from. Ethan Caldwell, he said. I was told you would be joining us. His tone was respectful, but distant. Like he was trying to understand why someone like me was included in an important meeting. I sat down calmly. Thank you for having me. The meeting began with numbers, projections, and discussions about the company's future. I listened more than I spoke. That had always been my approach. The loudest person in the room was rarely the person with the best answer. As the conversation continued, I noticed something. Alexander was talented. There was no doubt about that. He understood business. He understood people. But he also carried the confidence of someone who believed he had earned every advantage around him. At one point, he discussed a major decision that would affect the company's direction. The executives around the table agreed quickly. Everyone seemed comfortable following his lead. I looked at the documents in front of me and quietly asked one question. Have you considered what happens if the market changes within the next 18 months? The room became slightly quieter. Alexander looked at me. We have considered multiple scenarios. I nodded. I am sure you have. But sometimes the biggest risks are hidden inside the things that look the safest. For a moment, he studied me differently. Not as an ordinary guest. Not as someone who simply belonged in the room. But as someone whose opinion carried weight. The meeting continued for another hour. I did not reveal anything about my past. I did not mention the company history. I did not explain my connection. I simply listened. After the meeting ended, I stepped outside and looked across the city. The streets were busy. Cars moved through intersections. People walked between buildings chasing their own dreams. It reminded me of something I had forgotten. A person's value does not disappear just because others stop noticing it. Later that evening, I received another call from Daniel Brooks. How did it go? He asked. I smiled. Interesting. There was a pause. Then he laughed softly. Did he recognize you? Not yet. Daniel understood immediately. Sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive. I looked out the window of my home that night, thinking about how quickly life can change. Victoria believed she had traded an ordinary man for someone extraordinary. Alexander believed he had built an empire that belonged completely to him. They both believed they understood the situation. But they were missing one important detail. The man they underestimated was still connected to everything they valued. And soon, they would have to face the truth they never expected. The first sign that something was changing inside Alexander Reed's world was not a headline or a dramatic announcement. It was a quiet phone call that came 3 days after the meeting. I was sitting in my home office, the same room where I had spent countless mornings reviewing old documents and enjoying the peace I once fought so hard to create. The number on my phone belonged to Daniel Brooks. I answered and heard the seriousness in his voice immediately. Ethan, something is happening at the company. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. The neighborhood was calm. A few children were riding bicycles down the street. A delivery truck stopped at the house across from mine. It looked like an ordinary afternoon, but I knew better than most people that important changes often begin quietly. What happened? I asked. Daniel explained that several major investors had started asking questions about the company's direction. The recent decisions under Alexander's leadership had created uncertainty. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing was falling apart overnight. But the confidence people once had was beginning to disappear. That was how it always worked in business. The biggest problems rarely arrived with warning signs everyone could see. They appeared as small details that only experienced people noticed. I remembered my first years building the company. There were moments when everything looked perfect from the outside, but I knew exactly where the weak points were. Every successful organization had pressure points. Every leader had moments where they had to choose between protecting their image and facing reality. Does Alexander know? I asked. Daniel paused. He knows there are concerns, but I do not think he understands how serious they are. I understood that feeling. Confidence could be useful, but too much confidence could make people stop listening. After the call ended, I walked into the kitchen and made another cup of coffee. It was a habit I developed years ago. When life became complicated, I returned to simple routines. A warm cup of coffee, a quiet room, a moment to think before making a decision. That evening, I received a message from Victoria. It was the first time she had contacted me since the divorce. I heard you were involved with Alexander's company. I looked at the message for several seconds. I wondered what she had heard. I wondered who told her. Most importantly, I wondered what she believed. I replied with only one sentence. I attended a business meeting. A few minutes passed before another message appeared. I hope everything is going well for you. I stared at those words. There was a time when I would have searched for hidden meaning. I would have wondered if she missed me or regretted her decision. But time changes the way you see things. Sometimes people do not miss the person they left. Sometimes they miss the comfort they had before they left. I placed the phone down and returned to my office. The next morning, I received another invitation from the company. This time, it was not a simple meeting. It was a request to discuss long-term strategy with senior leadership. That was different. They were no longer asking for my opinion as an outside observer. They were asking because they needed perspective from someone who understood the foundation beneath them. When I arrived at the building again, the atmosphere felt different. People moved quickly. Conversations stopped when executives walked by. The energy inside the company had changed. I entered the conference room and saw Alexander already there. He looked more serious than before. The confidence was still present, but there was something new behind his expression. Uncertainty. He looked at me and gave a polite nod. "Ethan, I appreciate you coming back." I took my seat. Of course. The meeting started with financial reports and future plans. Everyone spoke carefully. Everyone measured their words. Then one executive placed a document on the table and said, "There is one question we need answered." The room became quiet. I looked at the paper in front of me. It was a question about the company's original structure. A question about ownership history. A question that only a few people in the world could answer. I slowly looked around the room. Years ago, I created this company with a vision. I built the foundation. I made the difficult choices. Then I stepped away and allowed others to continue the journey. But now, the moment I always knew could come was finally approaching. The truth was no longer something I needed to explain. It was something everyone else was about to discover. The moment the document was placed on the table, I knew the past was finally catching up with the present. For years, I had watched people talk about the company as if they understood every piece of it. They knew the public story. They knew the headlines. They knew the executives who stood in front of cameras. But they did not know the foundation underneath everything. The room became quiet as the senior executive beside Alexander turned the document toward the center of the table. "There is a question about the original ownership structure," he said. "Some records indicate that there may be an individual connected to this company who has not been publicly involved for many years." Alexander looked at the paper, then looked around the room. His expression changed slightly. It was not fear. It was uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that appears when someone realizes there is a part of the story they never knew. I sat there calmly because I had seen this moment coming. Not this exact room. Not this exact day. But I knew eventually people would have questions. Success leaves a trail. Decisions leave records. Foundations leave fingerprints. The executive continued explaining the situation. Several investors wanted clarification about the company's original agreements and long-term vision. They wanted to understand why certain strategies from the past still influence the company's direction today. Alexander listened carefully. Then he looked at me. "Ethan, you seem familiar with some of these details." I gave a simple answer. I have followed the company for a long time. It was true, but it was not the whole truth. There was a time when I sat in rooms like this and made the decisions that shaped the future of thousands of employees. There was a time when my signature could change the direction of the entire organization. But I never needed to remind people of that. I believed real confidence did not require constant recognition. After the meeting ended, Alexander approached me. The difference between this moment and our first meeting was impossible to ignore. Before, he saw me as someone invited into his world. Now, he looked at me like someone he was trying to understand. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Of course." He hesitated for a moment. "How much do you actually know about this company?" I looked through the glass wall at the city outside. Thousands of people moved through the streets below, each carrying their own stories that nobody else could see. "More than most people," I answered. Alexander studied my face. He was searching for an explanation, but I was not ready to give him everything yet. Not because I wanted to create a dramatic moment. Because timing mattered. The truth was not powerful because it surprised people. The truth was powerful because it changed how they understood everything that came before it. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me again. "Ethan, they are getting closer to finding out." I smiled slightly. "I know. Are you ready?" he asked. I looked around my quiet office at home. The same place where I had rebuilt my life after Victoria left. The same place where I learned that losing someone's approval did not mean losing my value. "I have always been ready," I said. The next morning, another meeting was scheduled. This one included members of the board who had not attended the previous discussions. More people would be in the room. More questions would be asked. More pieces of the past would come together. I knew what was waiting for me. I knew there would be a moment when everyone finally connected the name, the history, and the decisions that built the company. But I also knew something else. I was not walking into that room to prove I was important. I was walking in because the truth deserved a place at the table. And for the first time in years, I was ready to stop hiding from a story that had always belonged to me. The room felt different when I walked in that morning. Not because the furniture had changed. Not because the people around the table had changed. The difference was in the way everyone looked at the situation. For the first time, they were no longer discussing a mystery. They were searching for the person behind it. I entered the boardroom carrying the same leather folder I had carried for years. Nothing about me looked different. I was still wearing a simple navy jacket. I still walked in quietly. I still took my seat without needing attention. But this time, the room was filled with people who were about to discover a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Alexander Reed sat across from me. He looked composed, but I noticed the small changes. The way he reviewed the documents twice. The way he listened more carefully than before. Confidence was still there, but certainty had started to disappear. The chairman of the board opened the meeting by discussing the company's history. He spoke about the early years, the original vision, and the decisions that shaped the organization. Then he reached the part everyone had been waiting for. There is one name connected to this company that has not been publicly recognized in many years. The room became silent. A document was placed in front of the board members. It contained records, agreements, and historical information from the company's earliest days. I watched as people read through the pages. Some looked surprised. Others looked confused. Alexander picked up the document and slowly turned each page. Then he stopped. His eyes moved from the paper to me. For a moment, nobody said anything. It was the kind of silence where everyone already knew something important had changed, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say it. Finally, one board member looked at me and asked, "Mr. Caldwell, can you explain your connection to this company?" I looked around the room. I thought about all the years that had passed. I thought about the late nights, the difficult decisions, and the moments when I had to choose between chasing recognition and living a meaningful life. Then I answered calmly. I founded this company. The words were simple. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth did not require an announcement. It only required a moment to be heard. The reaction around the table was immediate. Several people looked back at the documents. They were not questioning me. They were trying to understand how they had missed something so important. Alexander remained quiet. He looked at me differently now. Not with arrogance. Not with suspicion. With realization. "You were the founder?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He looked down for a moment. I could almost see him replaying every conversation we had ever had. The first meeting. The questions I asked. The advice I gave. The things he thought were observations from an outsider were actually coming from someone who knew the company better than anyone in the room. The chairman continued explaining that I had stepped away years earlier, but maintained ownership and strategic influence through private agreements. I had never wanted public attention. I had trusted others to continue the mission. Alexander finally spoke. I did not know. I looked at him. Most people did not. There was no anger in my voice. No desire to embarrass him. I understood something important after Victoria left. People often judge what they can see. They rarely take time to understand what exists beneath the surface. Alexander had seen a quiet man living a simple life. He had not seen the years of work behind that quiet life. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The questions were different now. People were no longer asking who I was. They were asking what I thought. They wanted my perspective. They wanted my experience. They wanted the person who had built the foundation to help guide the future. After the meeting ended, Alexander approached me near the entrance. For the first time since we met, he looked genuinely humble. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you without knowing the full story." I accepted his words with a simple nod. Everyone makes assumptions. What matters is what you do after you learn the truth. He looked at me for a moment, then lowered his voice. I should have shown more respect. I smiled slightly. Respect is not about someone's position. It is about recognizing someone's value. As I walked out of the building that day, I realized something. The world had finally discovered what I had never needed to prove. I was never the man who lost everything. I was the man who chose what truly mattered. And now, the people who once looked past me were finally seeing the person who had been there all along. The first time Victoria contacted me after the truth came out, I expected many things. I expected questions. I expected explanations. I expected maybe even silence. What I did not Expect was a message that began with my name and ended with words I never thought I would hear from her. Ethan, I think we need to talk. I looked at the screen for a long moment. Months earlier, that message would have controlled my entire day. I would have wondered what she meant. I would have searched for hidden emotions behind every word. I would have hoped it was a sign that she finally understood what she had lost. But time changes the way you see people. Time gives you the ability to separate what someone says from what they truly mean. I replied with a simple answer. We can talk. The meeting was arranged at a small coffee shop near the park, the kind of place where people came to have quiet conversations away from crowded offices. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early. That surprised me. She had always valued appearances, always wanted everything to look perfectly planned. But that day, she looked different. Not broken, not defeated, just uncertain. She looked at me across the table, and for the first time in a long time, I saw someone who was not completely sure of her own decisions. I did not know, she said. I remained quiet. I did not know who you really were. I looked down at my coffee cup and thought about that sentence. It was honest, but it also revealed something important. Victoria was not saying she misunderstood me. She was saying she only valued what she could see. You always thought I was hiding something, I said calmly. She looked away. I thought you had given up. I nodded slowly. I did give something up. I gave up chasing a version of success that was making me unhappy. The silence between us felt different from the silence in our old home. This silence was not filled with disappointment. It was filled with understanding. Alexander told me about the meeting, she said. He said you were respectful. I almost smiled. Alexander had changed. Not because I demanded it. Not because anyone forced him to. He changed because learning the truth changed his perspective. He was never a bad person, I said. Victoria looked surprised. After everything, you still say that? I nodded. People make mistakes. The important thing is whether they learn from them. She looked at me carefully. I made a mistake. Those words carried more weight than any apology she could have offered. Because for the first time, Victoria was not blaming circumstances. She was not blaming timing. She was not blaming our differences. She was accepting responsibility. But there was something I understood by then. Forgiveness and returning were not the same thing. Some doors close not because there is anger behind them, but because people grow in different directions. Ethan, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I stayed? She asked. I looked outside at people walking through the park. Families spending time together. Friends sharing conversations. Ordinary moments that many people overlooked until they were gone. Sometimes, I answered, but wondering about another life can make you forget to appreciate the one you have. She became quiet. I could tell she wanted to ask something else, but she stopped herself. Maybe because she already knew the answer. The man sitting across from her was not the same man who signed those divorce papers. Not because I became richer. Not because people finally respected me. I changed because I stopped needing someone else to recognize my value. Before we left, Victoria stood and looked at me one more time. I really did not understand you. I gave her a small smile. Most people do not understand what they never take the time to see. She nodded, and for a moment, there was a sense of peace between us. Not the peace of two people starting over. The peace of two people finally accepting the truth. As I walked back to my car, I thought about everything that had happened. Victoria once believed she was choosing a better future. Alexander once believed he had reached the highest point of success. But both of them learned the same lesson. A person's worth is not created by applause, money, or status. It exists long before anyone notices. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. It is reaching a place where their opinion no longer defines you. After everything that happened, I expected life to feel different. I thought there would be some dramatic moment where I finally felt like I had won. I thought proving the truth would bring some kind of satisfaction. But what I discovered was something much quieter. Real peace does not arrive with applause. It arrives when you no longer need anyone to understand your worth. In the months after the board meeting, the company entered a period of rebuilding. Not because it was falling apart, but because every successful organization reaches moments where it has to decide what comes next. Alexander Reed remained in his position, but his approach changed. The confidence that once made him move quickly was replaced by patience. He started asking more questions. He started listening before making decisions. I noticed the difference because I had spent years learning that leadership was not about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about understanding the responsibility that came with every decision. Daniel Brooks called me one afternoon while I was working in my home office. "You know, I never thought I would see Alexander ask for advice," he said with a laugh. I smiled. Everyone has room to grow. Daniel became quiet for a moment. "That is what makes you different, Ethan. You had every reason to make people feel small, but you chose not to." I looked around the room. It was the same office where I had spent months rebuilding my life after Victoria left. The same desk where I questioned my choices. The same place where I wondered if people had been right about me. But now I understood something clearly. The most important changes in life often happen when nobody else is watching. Meanwhile, Victoria's world had changed as well. The life she imagined would bring endless excitement had become more complicated than she expected. She had discovered that success and happiness were not always found in the same place. She had chosen what looked impressive from the outside, but appearances rarely tell the complete story. One evening, I received a message from her. "I hope you know I am happy that things worked out for you." I read it carefully. There was no bitterness in those words. There was no attempt to rewrite the past. It was simply someone acknowledging a truth they had finally accepted. I replied, "I hope things work out for you too." And I meant it, because carrying resentment would only keep me connected to a chapter one had already closed. A few weeks later, I attended another company meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different from my first visit. People greeted me by name. Executives asked for my thoughts. Employees who had only known the public version of the company now understood the history behind it. But I did not feel like I was returning to claim something. I felt like I was visiting something I had once helped create and watching it continue. Alexander approached me after the meeting. "Ethan, I want to thank you," he said. "Not just for helping the company, for giving me the chance to see things differently." I nodded. A person is not defined by one mistake. They are defined by what they do after recognizing it. He smiled slightly. "I used to think success was about reaching the top. And now?" I asked. He looked around the room, filled with people working together. "Now I think success is about knowing why you are there." That answer stayed with me, because years earlier, I had learned the same lesson. I had spent so much time building something valuable that I almost forgot to protect the person building it. The person I had become was not created by the company, the money, or the recognition. Those things were only parts of the journey. The real achievement was finding balance, finding peace, finding a life that belonged to me. Looking back, I realized Victoria did not destroy my life when she left. She simply ended a chapter that I was too afraid to close myself. Her decision forced me to remember who I was before I started measuring myself through someone else's eyes. And that was the lesson I carried forward. Some people leave because they cannot see your value. Some people only understand after they lose access to it. But your worth was never created by their approval. It was always there, waiting for you to recognize it first. The day I finally understood my journey was not the day people learned my name. It was the day I stopped needing them to remember it. For years, I believed recognition was the reward waiting at the end of hard work. I thought if I built something meaningful, if I gave enough of myself, people would naturally understand the person behind the achievements. But life teaches lessons in unexpected ways. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who see only a small part of your story. Sometimes strangers understand your value before the people who shared your life. Looking back at everything that happened, I no longer see Victoria leaving as the moment my life changed. The real change happened afterward. It happened in the quiet mornings when I had to decide who I wanted to become without anyone else's expectations. It happened when I realized I did not need to prove that I was successful. I only needed to live in a way that felt honest. Months passed, and the company continued moving forward. Alexander Reed became a different kind of leader. He still carried confidence, but it was balanced with humility. He no longer walked into every room believing he already had every answer. He listened. He considered different perspectives. He understood that leadership was not about being above others. It was about helping others move forward. One afternoon, I visited the company headquarters and stood near the same glass windows where I had once watched the city years earlier. The view was almost identical. The buildings, the streets, the movement of thousands of people below. But I was different. Back then, I thought success was something I had to chase. Now I understood success was something I had to define for myself. Daniel Brooks joined me near the window and smiled. "You know, Ethan, there was a time when everyone thought you disappeared." I laughed softly. Maybe I did disappear. He looked at me with curiosity. What do you mean? I looked out at the city. I disappeared from the version of life where I was constantly trying to impress people who did not really know me. I found something better. Daniel nodded because he understood. The greatest changes are not always visible from the outside. Sometimes the biggest victories happen quietly inside a person. Victoria and I never became the same people we were before. That chapter of our lives had ended, and I accepted that. I did not need revenge. I did not need her to regret her choice every day. I did not need Alexander to remember the moment he underestimated me. Those things belonged to the past. What mattered was the future I was creating. A future where my decisions came from peace instead of proving a point. A future where my value came from within instead of from someone else's opinion. One evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset. It was a simple moment. No cameras, no meetings, no important people around me. Just a quiet evening and the feeling that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I thought about the man I was before everything changed. I thought about the husband who wanted to be understood. I thought about the man who signed divorce papers while wondering if he had lost everything. That man was still part of me, but he had learned something important. Losing someone who does not see your worth is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning of discovering yourself. People will always judge based on what they can see. They will measure success through money, titles, and appearances. But the most valuable things about a person are often the things nobody notices at first. Character, patience, integrity, the ability to keep moving forward when nobody is watching. Victoria once believed she was leaving behind an ordinary life. Alexander once believed he had reached the highest level of success. But in the end, we all learned the same lesson. A person's true value is not created when the world finally recognizes them. It exists long before that moment arrives. And the greatest achievement is not making others realize who you are. It is finally realizing it yourself.